The metal groaned under pressure as Marcus Chen drove the pry bar deeper into the rusted seam. Sweat dripped from his forehead, despite the cool morning air that swept through the dense pine forest of northern Michigan. Beside him, his chocolate Labrador retriever, Duke, whined softly and pawed at the ground, his usually calm demeanor replaced by nervous energy that made his tail twitch erratically. What Marcus was attempting to open defied explanation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The object before him appeared to be part of a massive vehicle, but it was buried so deep in the forest floor that decades of fallen leaves, moss, and small saplings had claimed it as part of the natural landscape. The metal surface was pitted with rust and corrosion, yet underneath the decay, he could make out what appeared to be industrial-grade steel plating, far thicker than anything found on civilian vehicles. With a sudden screech that sent a flock of ravens bursting from the nearby trees, the metal panel shifted. A wave of stale, musty air escaped from the darkness within, carrying with it the scent of decay and something far more unsettling. Duke backed away, his hackles rising as he let out a low growl that Marcus had never heard before in their 5 years together. The wilderness of northern Michigan had become Marcus Chen's refuge in ways he never could have anticipated. At 34, he carried himself with the measured precision of someone who had learned that careless movements could mean the difference between life and death. His black hair, cropped short in a style that would never quite abandon its military origins, was beginning to show the first hints of premature gray at the temples. The harsh lines around his dark eyes spoke of sleepless nights and memories that refused to fade, while his compact but muscular frame moved through the forest with an economy of motion that betrayed years of specialized training. Marcus had purchased the remote cabin 6 months earlier, using the last of his military savings and a modest inheritance from his grandmother. The property sat on 47 acres of untouched woodland, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound through miles of state forest. The nearest neighbor was 8 miles away, and the closest town, a place called Cedar Falls, was a 20-minute drive through winding back roads that seemed to lead nowhere and everywhere at once. The decision to isolate himself had not been made lightly. After 3 tours of duty as a combat engineer in Afghanistan, Marcus had returned home to find that the world he once knew no longer fit him like a comfortable jacket. The suburbs felt claustrophobic, the noise of traffic and conversation overwhelming to senses that had been trained to detect the slightest anomaly that might signal danger. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by dreams that blended memory with imagination in ways that left him exhausted and disoriented. Duke had been prescribed, in a manner of speaking, by a VA counselor who specialized in post-traumatic stress. The chocolate lab had been trained specifically to work with veterans, his calm temperament and intuitive understanding of human distress making him invaluable in ways that traditional therapy had failed to achieve. Duke could sense the onset of anxiety attacks before Marcus was even aware of them, positioning himself as a warm, steady presence that anchored his handler to the present moment. The morning that would change everything had started like any other. Marcus rose before dawn, as had become his habit, brewing strong coffee in the kitchen of his modest cabin while Duke stretched and yawned on his oversized dog bed near the wood-burning stove. The October air carried the crisp promise of winter, and the maple trees surrounding the property had transformed into a spectacular display of gold and crimson that made the forest feel like a cathedral of living color. Marcus had planned a routine patrol of his property boundaries, something he did twice weekly to check for fallen trees, damaged fencing, or signs of the occasional poacher who might mistake his land for state property. Duke trotted alongside him, occasionally veering off to investigate interesting scents but never straying far from his human companion. The familiar rhythm of walking through the woods had become a form of meditation for Marcus, a way of quieting the constant vigilance that his military service had embedded in his nervous system. They had been following an old deer trail that meandered through a section of the property Marcus had never fully explored when Duke suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. The dog's entire body went rigid, his nose working frantically as he tested the air. Unlike his usual enthusiastic investigation of new scents, this behavior carried an undertone of distress that immediately put Marcus on alert. Duke began moving toward a dense thicket of young pine trees, his tail low and his movement cautious. Marcus followed, pushing through the thick undergrowth until they emerged into a small natural clearing that was dominated by what appeared to be a large moss-covered boulder. But as Marcus examined the formation more closely, he realized that the surface was too uniform, too geometric to be natural stone. Kneeling beside the object, Marcus brushed away decades of accumulated organic matter with his hands. Beneath the moss and rotted leaves, he felt the unmistakable texture of manufactured metal. The surface was heavily corroded but showed clear evidence of welding seams and what appeared to be reinforced joints. This was not some piece of abandoned farm equipment or a discarded appliance. The construction was too robust, too purposeful. Duke continued to circle the object, his agitation increasing rather than diminishing as they spent more time in the clearing. The dog's behavior troubled Marcus more than the mysterious object itself. In all their time together, Duke had never shown fear of anything they encountered in the woods. Curious caution, yes, but never this kind of nervous energy that seemed to border on panic. Marcus returned to the cabin to retrieve tools, his mind racing with possibilities. The object's location, buried deep in his property and covered by growth that suggested decades of concealment, ruled out recent dumping. Whatever this was, it had been here long before Marcus owned the land, possibly longer than he had been alive. The heavy-duty construction suggested military or industrial origins, but neither explanation made sense for something buried in the middle of a Michigan forest. The pry bar he selected from his workshop had served him well during his military service, designed for breaching operations where brute force needed to be applied with precision. As he worked to find purchase points along what appeared to be a panel or door seam, Marcus found himself slipping into the focused mindset that had kept him alive in combat zones. Every sound registered in his consciousness, every movement was deliberate and calculated. The metal fought him with the stubborn resistance of decades of corrosion. Rust flaked away in orange cascades as he worked the pry bar deeper into the seams, searching for the point where the metal would yield. Duke maintained his nervous vigil, occasionally approaching the object only to back away again, his whines growing more urgent with each passing minute. When the panel finally gave way, the sound was like a gunshot echoing through the quiet forest. The sudden release of pressure sent Marcus stumbling backward, and the wave of air that escaped from the interior carried scents that made both man and dog recoil instinctively. The smell was not just of age and decay, but of something organic that had been sealed away from the natural cycle of decomposition for far too long. Marcus retrieved a powerful LED flashlight from his kit and directed its beam into the opening he had created. What he saw defied immediate comprehension. The interior space was larger than the external dimensions had suggested, indicating that most of the structure remained buried beneath the forest floor. The walls were lined with what appeared to be military-grade steel plating, and the floor was littered with objects that caught the light in strange, unsettling ways. As his eyes adjusted to the contrast between the bright LED beam and the surrounding darkness, Marcus began to make out individual items scattered throughout the space. There were pieces of what looked like electronic equipment, their cases corroded and their purposes obscured by time. Scattered papers, yellowed and brittle, were held down by the weight of fallen debris, and in the far corner, partially obscured by shadows, lay something that made Marcus's blood run cold. It was a helmet, military issue, but of a design he did not immediately recognize.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The chin strap had rotted away, but the shell itself remained intact, a dark green color that had faded to an olive drab patina. Beside it lay what appeared to be pieces of uniform fabric, also military in origin, but bearing no visible insignia or identification. Duke refused to approach the opening, instead positioning himself at the edge of the clearing where he could watch both Marcus and the surrounding woods. His agitation had transformed into a state of hyper-alert vigilance, as if he expected something to emerge from either the buried structure or the forest itself. The dog's behavior reinforced Marcus's growing sense that this discovery was far more significant than a simple piece of abandoned equipment. Marcus photographed everything he could see from the opening, using his smartphone's camera to document the interior before disturbing anything further. The military engineer in him recognized the importance of preserving the scene as he found it, even though he had no idea what protocols might apply to a discovery like this. The equipment visible in the photographs appeared to be decades old, possibly dating back to the Cold War era, but its purpose remained entirely unclear. The papers scattered throughout the interior proved too fragile to handle without proper preservation techniques, but Marcus was able to make out fragments of text on some of the more intact pieces. What he could read appeared to be technical documentation, filled with reference numbers and abbreviations that meant nothing to him. One partially visible header caught his attention, bearing what looked like a military classification marking, but the rest of the text was too damaged to decipher. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus found himself torn between the desire to investigate further and a growing sense that he had stumbled upon something that was meant to remain hidden. The location of the buried structure, deep in private property and concealed by decades of natural growth, suggested that its concealment had been deliberate. The military-grade construction and the presence of what appeared to be classified materials raised questions that Marcus was not sure he wanted answered. Duke's persistent agitation finally convinced Marcus to seal the opening and retreat to the cabin to consider his options. Using a tarp weighted down with rocks, he covered the breach he had created, making sure that casual observation would not reveal the disturbance. The decision felt like a temporary measure, a way of buying time while he decided how to proceed. Back at the cabin, Marcus spread the photographs he had taken across his kitchen table, studying them under the bright overhead light. The more he examined the images, the more convinced he became that he had discovered something significant, possibly something that powerful people had gone to great lengths to keep hidden. The equipment visible in the photographs bore serial numbers and manufacturing codes that suggested government origins, but the age and design of the items placed them in an era when such technology would have been highly classified. Sleep did not come easily that night. Marcus found himself lying awake, staring at the ceiling while Duke paced restlessly through the cabin. The dog's behavior had not returned to normal even after they left the clearing, and his continued agitation served as a constant reminder that their discovery had disturbed something that had been at rest for decades. Every sound from the surrounding forest seemed amplified, every creak of the cabin's settling timber a potential sign of approaching danger. The next morning brought a decision that Marcus had been postponing since the moment he first saw the interior of the buried structure. He needed answers, and those answers would require research that went beyond what he could accomplish in isolation. The nearest library was in Cedar Falls, and if he was going to understand what he had found, he would need access to historical records and military databases that might shed light on the age and purpose of the buried equipment. The drive to Cedar Falls took Marcus through countryside that seemed to exist outside of time, past small farms and abandoned homesteads that spoke of a rural economy that had long since moved elsewhere. The town itself was a collection of brick buildings clustered around a central square, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business and strangers were noticed immediately. The public library occupied a Carnegie building that had been constructed in the early 1900s, its limestone facade weathered but dignified. The librarian, a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, greeted Marcus with the polite curiosity reserved for unfamiliar faces. Her nameplate identified her as Helen Morrison, and her manner suggested someone who had spent decades helping people find information they needed, even when they were not entirely sure what they were looking for. Marcus introduced himself as a new property owner in the area, explaining that he was researching the history of his land for personal interest. This was technically true, though it omitted the rather significant detail of what he had discovered buried in his woods. Helen Morrison's expression warmed at his explanation, and she led him to a section of the library dedicated to local history and historical archives. The records available in Cedar Falls were more extensive than Marcus had expected for such a small community. The library maintained collections of local newspapers dating back to the 1940s, as well as property records, military service rolls, and oral history projects that documented the area's development over the past century. Helen Morrison proved to be an invaluable guide, pointing Marcus toward resources that might contain references to unusual military activity or government operations in the region. As Marcus began his research, he quickly discovered that northern Michigan had a more complex military history than he had realized. During World War II, the area had been home to several training facilities and research installations, some of which had remained classified long after the war ended. The remote location and sparse population made it an ideal location for activities that required secrecy, and the heavily forested terrain provided natural camouflage for facilities that were not intended to be discovered. One newspaper article from 1952 caught Marcus's attention immediately. The headline read, "Military personnel missing after training exercise," and the brief article described how 3 soldiers had disappeared during what was described as a routine navigation exercise in the state forest. The search had lasted for weeks, involving local law enforcement and additional military personnel, but no trace of the missing men had ever been found. The article noted that the military had classified the incident and declined to provide details about the nature of the training exercise or the equipment the soldiers had been carrying. Marcus photographed the article with his phone, noting the date and the names of the missing soldiers. Something about the story resonated with his discovery, though he could not yet articulate the connection. The timing was right, placing the incident in the early Cold War period when experimental military technology was advancing rapidly and secrecy was paramount. The location was also significant, as the reported area of the training exercise included sections of what was now his property. Further research revealed additional references to unusual military activity in the region during the 1950s and early 1960s. A 1954 article mentioned specialized equipment testing being conducted in partnership with local authorities, while a 1959 piece described complaints from residents about strange lights and sounds coming from the forest at night. All of these incidents shared common characteristics. They involved military personnel, they occurred in remote areas, and the official explanations were vague to the point of being meaningless. The pattern that emerged from Marcus's research suggested a sustained period of classified military activity in the region, followed by an abrupt cessation of all such operations sometime in the mid-1960s. The timing coincided with major shifts in military strategy and technology, as well as budget cuts that affected numerous Cold War research programs. It seemed plausible that whatever facility or operation had been responsible for the buried equipment had simply been abandoned when funding disappeared or priorities changed. Marcus spent the entire day at the library, making copies of relevant articles and taking detailed notes about dates, locations, and personnel. By the time Helen Morrison announced that the library would be closing in 15 minutes, he had accumulated a substantial file of information that painted a picture of his property's hidden history. The research had answered some questions while raising many others, but it had also convinced him that his discovery was far more significant than he had initially realized. The drive home through the darkening forest felt different than it had that morning. The knowledge that his peaceful retreat had once been the site of classified military operations changed the way Marcus perceived the landscape around him. Every shadow could conceal evidence of past activities. Every unexplained clearing might mark the location of a former installation. The isolation that had once felt protective now seemed ominous, as if the forest itself was keeping secrets that it was reluctant to reveal. Duke greeted Marcus's return with obvious relief, his tail wagging enthusiastically, as if his human companion had been gone for days rather than hours. But even as they went through their evening routine of feeding and walking, Marcus could sense that the dog remained on edge. Duke's behavior around the cabin was subtly different, more alert and watchful, as if he too had been affected by the knowledge of what lay buried in their woods. That night, Marcus spread his research materials across the dining table, studying the articles and photographs by lamplight, while Duke dozed fitfully on his bed nearby. The missing soldiers from 1952 dominated his thoughts, their names and service records providing a human dimension to what had previously been an abstract puzzle.
Staff Sergeant Robert Williams, Corporal James Peterson, and Private First Class Michael Torres had been young men, little older than Marcus himself, when he first deployed to Afghanistan. The official reports describe the missing soldiers as participants in a routine navigation exercise, but Marcus's military experience told him that nothing involving classified equipment and remote locations was ever routine. The fact that their disappearance had led to such an extensive search, followed by immediate classification of all details, suggested that the stakes had been much higher than a simple training accident. These men had been involved in something important enough to warrant absolute secrecy, even decades after their disappearance. As Marcus examined the photographs he had taken of the buried structure's interior, he began to see details that he had missed during his initial shock at the discovery. The equipment visible in the images showed signs of hasty abandonment rather than careful decommissioning. Cables had been cut rather than properly disconnected, and some items appeared to have been damaged deliberately, as if someone had wanted to ensure that they could never be reactivated or analyzed. The military clothing and equipment scattered throughout the interior told a story of violence that Marcus had been reluctant to acknowledge during his first examination. What he had initially interpreted as the natural decay of abandoned materials now appeared to show signs of damage that preceded their burial. Fabric had been torn rather than simply degraded, and metal components showed impact marks that suggested they had been subjected to forces beyond normal wear and corrosion. The possibility that he had discovered not just abandoned equipment, but the final resting place of the missing soldiers from 1952 transformed Marcus's discovery from a historical curiosity into something approaching a crime scene. The thought that 3 young servicemen might have been buried in his woods, their fate concealed for more than 70 years, filled him with a sense of responsibility that went far beyond academic interest. Marcus found himself facing a decision that would determine not just his own future, but potentially the resolution of a decades-old mystery. He could report his discovery to the authorities, triggering an investigation that would bring law enforcement, military personnel, and media attention to his property. Such attention would destroy the peaceful isolation he had sought and expose him to scrutiny that his fragile mental state might not be able to handle. Alternatively, he could continue his investigation independently, using his military training and engineering skills to carefully excavate and document what lay buried in his woods. This approach would allow him to control the pace and scope of the investigation, but it would also place him in the position of disturbing what might be a grave site without proper authority or expertise. The third option, simply resealing the structure and pretending he had never found it, felt like a betrayal of the missing soldiers and their families, who had spent decades wondering what had happened to their loved ones. Marcus's own military service had taught him the importance of never leaving a fellow soldier behind, and the thought of abandoning the investigation felt like a violation of everything he believed about duty and honor. As the night wore on, Marcus found himself returning again and again to the photographs of the military helmet and uniform fragments. Somewhere beneath the accumulated debris and corrosion lay evidence that could provide answers to questions that had haunted families for generations.
The technical equipment buried alongside the human remains might reveal secrets about Cold War research programs that had been thought lost forever. Duke's restless movements through the cabin served as a constant reminder that the discovery had disturbed more than just historical artifacts. The dog's heightened alertness suggested that opening the buried structure had somehow changed the electromagnetic or atmospheric conditions of the area, triggering instincts that had evolved to detect danger. Marcus had learned to trust Duke's judgment in matters of personal safety, and the animal's continued agitation convinced him that his discovery carried risks that extended beyond the merely academic. The decision, when it finally came, felt both inevitable and terrifying. Marcus would continue the investigation, but he would do so carefully and methodically, treating the site with the respect due to both a historical artifact and a potential grave. He would document everything he found, preserving evidence that might someday provide closure to families who had waited decades for answers, and he would proceed alone, at least initially, until he better understood what he was dealing with and what dangers it might present. The commitment to continue felt like stepping across a threshold from which there would be no return. Marcus's peaceful retirement to the Michigan woods had been intended as an escape from the complexities and dangers of his military service, but his discovery had thrust him back into a world of secrets and mysteries that demanded the same skills and courage that had kept him alive in Afghanistan. The irony was not lost on him that he had traveled halfway around the world to serve his country, only to find that some of the most important battles were waiting for him in his own backyard. The first warning came 3 days after Marcus returned from the library in Cedar Falls. He discovered it while conducting his morning perimeter check, a routine that had become second nature during his military service and which he had maintained even in civilian life. Duke walked slightly ahead, his nose working the morning air, when he suddenly froze near the eastern boundary of the property. A small cairn of stones had been constructed overnight at the intersection of 2 deer trails, positioned precisely where Marcus would be certain to encounter it during his regular patrol. The arrangement was too deliberate to be natural, too carefully balanced to have been created by accident. Each stone had been selected for size and weight, stacked with the kind of precision that spoke of military training or construction experience. Duke circled the cairn warily, his hackles raised in a way that reminded Marcus uncomfortably of the dog's reaction to the buried structure. The chocolate lab's distress was immediate and profound, manifesting in whines and nervous pacing that suggested he could detect something about the arrangement that escaped human perception. Marcus photographed the cairn from multiple angles before carefully dismantling it, noting that each stone bore traces of a chalky white substance that had been used to mark specific points on their surfaces. The message was unmistakable in its simplicity. Someone knew about Marcus's presence on the property, had observed his routines closely enough to predict his movements, and possessed the skills necessary to move through dense forest without leaving obvious tracks. The positioning of the cairn suggested intimate familiarity with the property's layout, knowledge that could only have been acquired through extensive surveillance or prior experience with the land. Marcus spent the remainder of the morning searching for additional signs of intrusion, his combat-trained eyes scanning for disturbed vegetation, footprints or equipment caches that might indicate the presence of watchers. Duke accompanied him with obvious reluctance, his tail low and his movement cautious, as if he expected danger to materialize from the surrounding trees at any moment. The search revealed nothing concrete, but Marcus's trained instincts told him that the absence of evidence was itself significant. Professional surveillance left minimal traces when conducted properly, and the person or persons responsible for the warning cairn had clearly invested considerable effort in concealing their presence. The white markings on the stones suggested a communication system, possibly indicating duration of observation or level of perceived threat. Marcus had encountered similar techniques during counterintelligence training, where enemy operatives used environmental markers to coordinate activities and share information. The discovery forced Marcus to confront the possibility that his research in Cedar Falls had attracted unwanted attention. Small towns thrived on gossip, and his inquiries about military history and missing soldiers would not have gone unnoticed by residents who had lived through the events he was investigating.
Someone with a vested interest in keeping the past buried might have been alerted to his activities, prompting the surveillance that had culminated in the morning's warning. Marcus returned to the cabin with a heightened sense of vulnerability that he had not experienced since his final deployment to Afghanistan. The isolation that had once felt protective now seemed like a tactical disadvantage, cutting him off from potential assistance while providing numerous concealed positions for hostile observers. Duke's continued agitation served as a constant reminder that they were no longer alone in the forest, that eyes and ears were monitoring their every movement. The decision to accelerate his investigation came naturally, driven by both curiosity and the military maxim that remaining static in a dangerous situation only increased vulnerability. If someone was watching him, they were doing so for a reason connected to his discovery in the woods. The quickest way to resolve the situation was to uncover whatever truth they were trying to protect, bringing the matter into the open where it could be addressed through proper channels. Marcus spent the afternoon preparing for a more thorough exploration of the buried structure, assembling equipment and supplies that would allow him to work efficiently while minimizing his exposure time. His military engineering background had taught him the importance of proper preparation, and he approached the task with the same methodical planning that had kept his unit alive during demolition operations in hostile territory. The toolkit he assembled included battery-powered LED worklights, a compact folding shovel designed for archaeological work, evidence bags and containers for preserving artifacts, and a digital camera capable of recording both photographs and video in low-light conditions. He also packed a portable air quality monitor, borrowed from his days working with potentially contaminated sites, to ensure that gases from the sealed chamber would not pose a health hazard. Duke's reluctance to approach the excavation site became more pronounced as they made their way through the forest that evening. The dog lagged behind Marcus's usual pace, frequently stopping to test the air or listen to sounds that escaped human perception. His behavior suggested that whatever had disturbed him about the original discovery had intensified rather than diminished, as if the passage of time had somehow amplified the site's unsettling properties. The buried structure appeared unchanged from Marcus's previous visit. The tarp he had used to cover the opening still waited in place by the rocks he had positioned 3 days earlier.
But as he removed the covering and directed his flashlight into the interior, Marcus noticed details that had escaped his attention during the initial discovery. The scattered equipment showed signs of deliberate arrangement rather than random abandonment, as if someone had positioned items to create a specific visual narrative. The military helmet and uniform fragments that had initially caught his attention were positioned near what appeared to be a makeshift communications station, complete with vacuum tubes and wire assemblies that suggested 1950s-era radio technology. The equipment had been damaged extensively, but not by the passage of time or environmental exposure. Circuit boards had been smashed with deliberate force, and critical components had been removed entirely, creating gaps in the assemblies that rendered them completely inoperable. Marcus began a systematic documentation process, photographing each item from multiple angles before carefully removing it from the chamber. The work was slow and painstaking, requiring him to crawl partially into the buried space while maintaining constant awareness of structural stability and air quality. Duke positioned himself at the chamber entrance, serving as both sentinel and early warning system for any approaching threats. The first breakthrough came when Marcus discovered a metal document case wedged beneath one of the damaged radio assemblies. The case was military issue, constructed of aluminum and rubber gaskets designed to protect contents from moisture and impact damage. Unlike the other equipment in the chamber, the document case showed minimal corrosion, suggesting that its seals had remained intact throughout decades of burial. Opening the case required careful manipulation of corroded latches and degraded gasket material, but Marcus's engineering background had taught him patience with precision mechanisms. When the lid finally yielded, it revealed a collection of papers that had been preserved in remarkable condition by the case's protective environment. The documents were typed on official military letterhead, bearing classification stamps and reference numbers that immediately commanded Marcus's attention. The top document in the stack was labeled Operation Deep Forest Personnel Roster and Equipment Manifest, dated September 15, 1952. The list contained the names of the 3 missing soldiers Marcus had discovered during his library research, along with detailed inventories of specialized equipment that had been assigned to their unit. The technical specifications described radio gear far more advanced than anything Marcus had seen in museums or historical displays, suggesting experimental technology that had been decades ahead of its time. Marcus photographed each document carefully, ensuring that classification markings and technical details were clearly visible in the images. The papers painted a picture of a highly classified research operation that had been conducting field tests of prototype communication equipment in remote forest locations. The technology being tested appeared to involve early attempts at secure military communications, possibly including encryption capabilities that would not become standard until the 1970s. The personnel files contained in the document case revealed that Staff Sergeant Robert Williams, Corporal James Peterson, and Private First Class Michael Torres had been specially selected for the operation based on their technical backgrounds and security clearances. All 3 men had received advanced training in electronic warfare and communications security, qualifications that placed them among the most highly skilled technicians in the military at that time. A separate folder within the case contained what appeared to be incident reports and witness statements related to the disappearance of the 3-man team. The documents described a catastrophic equipment failure during a routine test of prototype communication gear, followed by an immediate loss of contact with the remote testing site. Search and rescue operations had been initiated within hours, but no trace of the personnel or equipment had been recovered despite extensive efforts. The final document in the case was a memorandum dated October 30, 1952, bearing the signature of a colonel whose name had been redacted from all other materials. The memo ordered the immediate termination of Operation Deep Forest and the classification of all related materials under the highest levels of military secrecy. The language used in the termination order suggested that the equipment failure had resulted in consequences far more serious than the simple disappearance of 3 soldiers. Marcus emerged from the chamber with a profound sense that he had uncovered something far more significant than a Cold War research accident. The deliberate destruction of equipment, the careful preservation of selected documents, and the burial of the entire site suggested a cover-up operation that had been planned and executed at the highest levels of military command. Someone had wanted the truth about Operation Deep Forest to remain hidden, but they had also wanted evidence to survive for eventual discovery. Duke's agitation had intensified during Marcus's work in the chamber, the dog's nervous pacing and frequent glances toward the surrounding forest, indicating that they were no longer alone at the site. Marcus packed his equipment quickly, his military training recognizing the signs of imminent danger that his canine companion was detecting. The forest around them had grown unnaturally quiet, the normal sounds of wind and wildlife replaced by a tense silence that suggested the presence of human observers. The return journey to the cabin felt like a tactical withdrawal from hostile territory, with Marcus constantly scanning for signs of pursuit while Duke maintained a defensive posture that kept potential threats within his field of vision. They reached the safety of the cabin without incident, but Marcus's relief was tempered by the knowledge that their activities had almost certainly been observed by whoever was conducting surveillance on his property. Inside the cabin, Marcus spread the photographs of the documents across his dining table, studying them under bright artificial light while Duke positioned himself near the front door in a watchful pose that had become his standard posture since the discovery of the cairn. The technical specifications contained in the Operation Deep Forest materials described equipment capabilities that seemed almost impossible for 1952 technology, suggesting that the military had been experimenting with concepts that would not become reality for decades. The communication gear described in the equipment manifest included features like frequency-hopping radio transmission, encrypted data links, and remote monitoring capabilities that resembled modern battlefield communication systems. The fact that such advanced technology had been operational in 1952 raised questions about the official timeline of military technological development and suggested that classified research programs had achieved breakthroughs that remained secret even 70 years later. Marcus's research took on new urgency as he began cross-referencing the names and dates from the Operation Deep Forest documents with historical records and military databases available through public sources. The 3 missing soldiers had served in specialized units that officially did not exist according to standard military histories, suggesting that their assignments had been compartmentalized to maintain operational security, even within the military hierarchy. The technical specifications for the prototype communication equipment led Marcus into research areas that required his engineering background to fully comprehend. The documents described frequency manipulation techniques and signal processing methods that would not appear in civilian technology until the advent of modern digital communications. The implications suggested that military research had been decades ahead of publicly acknowledged technological capabilities, maintaining a technological advantage through absolute secrecy. As Marcus delved deeper into the technical aspects of Operation Deep Forest, he began to understand why the operation had been terminated so abruptly and why evidence of its existence had been buried so thoroughly. The communication technology being tested represented a strategic advantage that could have fundamentally altered the balance of power during the Cold War. If the equipment had functioned as designed, it would have given the United States an undetectable method of military communication that no enemy could intercept or decode. The incident reports contained in the document case suggested that the prototype equipment had experienced a catastrophic failure during its final test, but the nature of that failure was described in language so heavily redacted that its actual cause remained unclear. References to electromagnetic anomalies and uncontrolled energy discharge suggested that the equipment had malfunctioned in ways that its designers had not anticipated, possibly creating dangerous conditions that had threatened the safety of the test personnel. Marcus found himself faced with evidence that 3 young soldiers had died as a result of experimental technology that had been pushed beyond its safe operational limits. The burial of their remains along with the failed equipment represented not just a cover-up of technological failure, but a betrayal of the military's fundamental obligation to care for its personnel. The families of the missing soldiers had been told that their loved ones had died in a training accident, when in fact they had been killed by reckless experimentation with untested technology. The moral implications of his discovery weighed heavily on Marcus as he considered his options for proceeding with the investigation. The evidence he had uncovered could provide closure for families who had spent decades wondering about the fate of their missing relatives, but it would also expose a military cover-up that had successfully concealed the truth for more than 70 years. The political and legal ramifications of such a revelation would be enormous, potentially affecting military policies and government accountability measures that extended far beyond the specific case of Operation Deep Forest. Marcus's military background had taught him respect for operational security and the legitimate need to protect classified information that could compromise national security. But his engineer's training had also instilled in him a commitment to truth and accuracy that made it impossible to ignore evidence of institutional failure and deliberate deception. The decision about how to proceed with his discovery would require him to balance competing loyalties and determine which principles should take precedence. The surveillance that had begun with the stone cairn escalated dramatically during the night following Marcus's exploration of the buried chamber. He was awakened at approximately 2 in the morning by Duke's low growling, a sound that brought him immediately to full alertness with his heart racing and his senses hyper-aware of potential threats. The dog was positioned at the front window, his body tense and his gaze fixed on something in the darkness beyond the cabin's perimeter. Marcus retrieved his night vision scope from the bedroom closet, moving carefully to avoid creating shadows that might be visible to outside observers. The scope revealed 3 figures positioned at the edge of the forest clearing, their postures and equipment suggesting military or law enforcement backgrounds.
Two of the figures carried what appeared to be assault rifles, while the third operated some kind of electronic equipment that Marcus could not identify from his concealed observation position. The presence of armed surveillance confirmed Marcus's worst fears about the significance of his discovery. Whoever was monitoring his activities possessed the resources and authority to deploy professionally equipped personnel on private property, suggesting government involvement at levels that made his situation extremely dangerous.
The electronic equipment being operated by the third figure indicated sophisticated monitoring capabilities that could include audio surveillance, communications interception, or even electronic warfare systems designed to disable his own equipment. Marcus spent the remainder of the night in a state of tactical readiness, monitoring the positions of the surveillance team while preparing contingency plans for various scenarios. Duke remained on alert beside him, the dog's superior senses providing early warning of any movement toward the cabin. The surveillance team maintained their positions until just before dawn, withdrawing as quietly as they had arrived, but leaving behind the unmistakable message that Marcus's activities were being monitored at the highest levels. The morning brought a decision that Marcus had been avoiding since his first glimpse into the buried chamber. He could no longer proceed with his investigation in isolation, and he could not trust local authorities who might be compromised by the same forces that had concealed the truth about Operation Deep Forest for 7 decades. He needed to contact federal authorities who possessed both the jurisdiction and the resources necessary to properly investigate his discoveries while ensuring his own safety. Marcus's military service had brought him into contact with various federal agencies, including the FBI's Counterintelligence Division and the Defense Department's Inspector General's office. These organizations existed specifically to investigate cases involving government corruption and institutional cover-ups, and they possessed the security clearances necessary to handle classified materials without compromising ongoing operations. Contacting them would represent a point of no return, triggering an investigation that would transform his quiet retirement into the center of a federal case. The decision to reach out to federal authorities required Marcus to consider the potential consequences, not just for himself, but for the families of the missing soldiers and for the institutional reputation of the military he had served faithfully for 12 years. His discovery could provide long overdue answers and accountability, but it could also damage public trust in military institutions and create political controversy that might overshadow the human tragedy at the heart of Operation Deep Forest. Marcus spent the morning drafting a comprehensive report that detailed his discoveries, documented his research findings, and provided copies of all photographic evidence he had collected. The report was structured according to military standards for incident documentation, with clear chronological organization and technical specifications that would allow federal investigators to understand both the historical context and the current significance of his findings. He included detailed maps of his property, GPS coordinates for the burial site, and complete inventories of the artifacts and documents he had recovered. The process of creating the report forced Marcus to confront the full scope of what he had uncovered. Operation Deep Forest represented not just a single incident of military experimentation gone wrong, but evidence of institutional practices that had prioritized technological advancement over personnel safety and public accountability. The cover-up that had followed the operation's failure demonstrated a willingness to sacrifice individual justice for broader political and strategic objectives. As Marcus prepared to transmit his report to federal authorities, Duke's behavior provided a constant reminder of the dangers they faced. The dog had not returned to his normal relaxed state since the previous night's surveillance, maintaining a level of alertness that suggested ongoing threats to their safety. The surveillance team's withdrawal did not necessarily indicate that monitoring had ceased, and Marcus assumed that his communications and movements continued to be observed through methods he could not detect. The transmission of his report to the FBI's Detroit field office marked the point at which Marcus's private investigation became a federal matter, triggering protocols and procedures that would transform the remote Michigan forest into the center of a major criminal investigation. Marcus knew that his peaceful retirement was ending, but he also knew that he had uncovered a truth that demanded exposure regardless of the personal consequences. The 3 soldiers buried in his woods deserved justice, and their families deserved answers that had been denied to them for more than 70 years. The response from federal authorities came faster than Marcus had anticipated, arriving in the form of a secure phone call less than 6 hours after he transmitted his initial report. The voice on the other end identified himself as Special Agent David Richardson from the FBI's Government Corruption Unit, speaking with the kind of measured professionalism that suggested extensive experience with sensitive investigations. Agent Richardson's questions were precise and focused, indicating that he understood both the historical significance and the current security implications of Marcus's discoveries. The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours, during which Marcus provided detailed explanations of his research methods, his documentation procedures, and the security measures he had implemented to protect the integrity of evidence. Agent Richardson's response confirmed that the FBI took the matter seriously and would be deploying a full investigative team to secure the site and conduct a comprehensive examination of all materials. The agent also warned Marcus that he should expect his personal safety to become a concern as the investigation proceeded. Marcus ended the call with mixed feelings of relief and apprehension. The transfer of responsibility to federal authorities meant that he would no longer bear the burden of investigating alone, but it also meant that his property would become the center of an investigation that might attract media attention and political controversy. Duke seemed to sense the change in circumstances, his alertness shifting from defensive vigilance to the kind of focused attention he displayed when new routines were being established. The federal response team arrived the following morning in a convoy of black SUVs that seemed incongruous in the rural Michigan setting. Agent Richardson proved to be a man in his early 40s with graying hair and the kind of steady demeanor that inspired confidence in his competence and integrity. The team he brought included forensic specialists, military historians, and technical experts who possessed the skills necessary to properly evaluate both the historical artifacts and the advanced technology described in the Operation Deep Forest documents. Marcus found himself simultaneously relieved to hand over responsibility for the investigation and concerned about losing control over discoveries that had become deeply personal to him. Agent Richardson seemed to understand this conflict, taking time to explain how the investigation would proceed and what role Marcus might play in helping to uncover the full truth about Operation Deep Forest. The agent's approach was respectful and collaborative, acknowledging Marcus's expertise while making it clear that federal authorities would now take the lead in determining how the investigation would be conducted. The excavation began at dawn on a crisp October morning, with federal forensic teams establishing a secure perimeter around the burial site. While Marcus watched from his cabin porch, Duke remained close beside him, the chocolate lab's demeanor noticeably calmer now that professional authorities had assumed control of the investigation. The presence of uniformed agents and specialized equipment seemed to ease the tension that had gripped both man and dog for the past week. Agent Richardson approached Marcus as the initial site preparation was underway, carrying a tablet computer loaded with preliminary analysis of the Operation Deep Forest documents. The federal investigation had moved with remarkable speed, utilizing classified databases and historical records that were unavailable to civilian researchers. What they had uncovered in just 48 hours painted a picture far more complex and disturbing than Marcus's initial discoveries had suggested. The operation had been part of a larger research program known as Project Silent Thunder, which encompassed dozens of experimental communication and surveillance technologies being developed across multiple military installations throughout the early 1950s. Operation Deep Forest represented just one field test of equipment that was intended to provide American forces with undetectable long-range communication capabilities during the escalating tensions of the Cold War. Agent Richardson explained that the 3 missing soldiers had been volunteers for what they understood to be a routine equipment test, unaware that they were actually participating in the first field trial of technology that had never been tested outside laboratory conditions.
The prototype communication gear they carried incorporated experimental components that used principles of electromagnetic manipulation that were poorly understood even by their designers. The forensic team's preliminary examination of the buried chamber had revealed evidence supporting Marcus's theory about the catastrophic equipment failure. Radiation detectors had identified low-level contamination consistent with the breakdown of early electronic components, while soil analysis indicated that some kind of chemical reaction had occurred at the time of burial. The positioning of the remains suggested that the three soldiers had been working to contain or shut down malfunctioning equipment when they were overcome by whatever forces the failure had unleashed. Marcus found himself struggling with conflicting emotions as the investigation proceeded. Relief at having federal authorities validate his discoveries was tempered by anger at learning that 3 young men had died as a result of reckless experimentation with potentially dangerous technology. The institutional cover-up that had followed their deaths represented a betrayal of trust that struck at the heart of Marcus's own military service and his faith in the system he had sworn to defend. Agent Richardson seemed to understand Marcus's internal conflict, taking time to explain how the investigation would attempt to balance the need for historical truth with the legitimate requirements of national security. Some aspects of the Operation Deep Forest technology remained classified even 70 years later, as the principles involved had eventually led to communication systems that were still in use by modern military forces. The challenge would be providing accountability and closure while protecting information that could compromise current defensive capabilities. The excavation itself proved to be a delicate process that required both archaeological precision and hazardous materials protocols. The forensic team worked in shifts, carefully removing decades of accumulated soil and organic matter while documenting the position of every artifact and piece of evidence. Marcus was allowed to observe the process from a safe distance, his engineering background helping him understand the technical aspects of what the investigators were uncovering. The first major discovery came when excavators located the main body of the prototype communication equipment, a massive assembly of vacuum tubes, transformers and mechanical components that had been buried beneath the chamber floor. The device was far larger and more complex than anything Marcus had imagined from the document descriptions, resembling a cross between early computer equipment and industrial machinery. Radiation monitoring indicated that some components remained mildly radioactive, requiring specialized handling procedures that delayed the excavation process. Duke's behavior throughout the excavation provided an interesting counterpoint to the human investigation. As the forensic team systematically removed contaminated soil and equipment from the burial site, the dog's stress levels decreased noticeably, as if the elimination of whatever had been disturbing his senses was providing relief from weeks of anxiety. By the 3rd day of excavation, Duke had returned to something approaching his normal demeanor, though he continued to avoid the immediate area of the dig site.
The recovery of human remains required the involvement of military mortuary specialists who possessed the training and authority necessary to handle the remains of service members who had died in classified circumstances. The process was conducted with full military honors, acknowledging that Staff Sergeant Robert Williams, Corporal James Peterson, and Private First Class Michael Torres had died in service to their country, even though the circumstances of their deaths had been concealed for decades. Marcus attended the ceremonies that marked the formal recovery of the remains, finding closure in the knowledge that 3 forgotten soldiers would finally receive proper recognition for their sacrifice. Agent Richardson had arranged for the families of the deceased to be notified and given the opportunity to participate in final burial arrangements, bringing an end to decades of uncertainty about the fate of their loved ones. The technical analysis of the recovered equipment revealed the true scope of the Operation Deep Forest disaster. The prototype communication system had been designed to use atmospheric ionization techniques to create secure communication channels over vast distances, essentially turning the Earth's atmosphere into a natural radio antenna. The technology was theoretically sound, but practically dangerous, as it required the generation of powerful electromagnetic fields that could interact unpredictably with natural atmospheric conditions. Marcus learned that the equipment failure had occurred during a period of unusual solar activity, when increased electromagnetic radiation from space had interfered with the prototype's control systems. The resulting feedback loop had created an uncontrolled energy discharge that had killed the three operators instantly while contaminating the surrounding area with electromagnetic radiation that remained detectable decades later. The burial of the site had been necessary to prevent the spread of contamination, but it had also allowed the responsible authorities to avoid accountability for the deaths. The investigation revealed that similar incidents had occurred at other Project Silent Thunder research sites, resulting in additional casualties that had been classified and concealed from public knowledge. The pattern of institutional cover-up suggested a systematic disregard for personnel safety in pursuit of technological advantages during the early Cold War period. Marcus's discovery had opened a window into a chapter of military history that revealed uncomfortable truths about the costs of maintaining national security. Agent Richardson's team uncovered evidence that officials responsible for Operation Deep Forest had known about the risks associated with the prototype equipment, but had proceeded with field testing anyway, driven by pressure to deploy new communication capabilities before Soviet forces could develop countermeasures. The decision to use live personnel for the testing had been made despite the availability of remote operation options that could have eliminated the risk to human life. The political implications of the investigation extended far beyond the specific case of Operation Deep Forest. The revelation that military authorities had systematically concealed deaths resulting from experimental technology raised questions about accountability and oversight that reached into current Pentagon policies and procedures. Marcus found himself at the center of a story that would likely generate congressional hearings and policy reforms affecting how the military conducted research involving potentially dangerous technologies. As the forensic investigation neared completion, Marcus was approached by representatives from various government agencies who wanted to discuss his role in bringing the Operation Deep Forest cover-up to light. The offers ranged from consulting positions with military research oversight committees to academic positions that would allow him to continue investigating historical cases of institutional misconduct. The attention was overwhelming for someone who had sought isolation in the Michigan woods, but Marcus recognized the opportunity to ensure that similar cover-ups would not be possible in the future. The final phase of the investigation involved a comprehensive environmental assessment of Marcus's property to determine whether any residual contamination posed ongoing health risks. The testing revealed that electromagnetic radiation levels had returned to normal background levels, indicating that the natural decay of radioactive components had eliminated the hazards that had originally necessitated the burial of the site. Marcus's property was declared safe for continued habitation, though certain areas would remain off-limits pending final remediation efforts. Duke's remarkable sensitivity to the electromagnetic contamination became a subject of interest for researchers studying animal perception of environmental hazards. The dog's distress at the burial site had provided the earliest indication that something dangerous was concealed in the area, suggesting that trained animals might serve as valuable early warning systems for detecting similar contamination in other locations. The research implications extended beyond military applications to include environmental monitoring and disaster response scenarios. Marcus found himself reflecting on the series of events that had transformed his quiet retirement into a federal investigation with national implications. The discovery had begun with a simple desire to explore his new property, but it had evolved into an examination of institutional accountability and the proper balance between national security and public transparency. The experience had challenged his assumptions about military service and forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about the organization he had dedicated his career to serving. The personal cost of the investigation had been significant, requiring Marcus to abandon the peaceful isolation he had sought in favor of intense scrutiny and public attention. But the resolution of the Operation Deep Forest case had also provided him with a sense of purpose that had been missing since his retirement from active duty. The knowledge that his actions had brought closure to grieving families and accountability to institutional cover-ups gave meaning to the disruption of his carefully constructed solitude. Agent Richardson's final report on the Operation Deep Forest investigation would eventually become part of a larger study of Cold War-era military research programs, contributing to policy reforms designed to prevent similar incidents in the future. The case established new protocols for the oversight of experimental military technology and created mechanisms for families to seek information about service members who had died in classified circumstances. Marcus's role in exposing the cover-up earned him recognition from veterans advocacy groups and congressional committees investigating government accountability. The attention was personally uncomfortable for someone who preferred privacy, but Marcus accepted speaking engagements and testimony opportunities because he understood the importance of ensuring that institutional misconduct could not be concealed indefinitely. The investigation also revealed that Marcus's property had historical significance extending beyond the Operation Deep Forest incident. The remote location and natural concealment had made it attractive to various covert operations throughout the Cold War period, and archaeological surveys conducted during the environmental assessment uncovered evidence of additional buried installations dating to different time periods. The discoveries suggested that the area had served as a testing ground for classified research programs spanning several decades. Duke's recovery from the stress of living near electromagnetic contamination was complete by the time federal investigators concluded their work on the property. The dog had returned to his normal routine of accompanying Marcus on walks through the forest, though he continued to show heightened alertness in areas where excavation work had taken place. The experience had strengthened the bond between man and dog, as Marcus had learned to trust Duke's instincts about environmental dangers that escaped human detection. The completion of the investigation marked the beginning of a new chapter in Marcus's life, one that balanced his desire for privacy with his responsibility to ensure that the lessons learned from Operation Deep Forest were not forgotten. He accepted a position as a consultant with the Defense Department's Inspector General's office, work that allowed him to investigate similar cases while maintaining his residence in the Michigan woods. The cabin that had once been a refuge from the complexities of military service became a base of operations for Marcus's new mission of exposing institutional cover-ups and ensuring accountability for government misconduct. The irony was not lost on him that his attempt to escape his military past had led him to a role that was more directly connected to military reform than any position he had held during active duty. Duke adapted well to their new routine, which included regular travel to Washington for meetings and testimony sessions balanced with periods of quiet research and investigation at their forest home. The dog seemed to understand that their lives had changed permanently, and he approached each new challenge with the same loyal dedication that had made him invaluable during Marcus's recovery from combat stress. The legacy of Operation Deep Forest extended beyond the specific case to influence broader discussions about government transparency and accountability. Marcus's willingness to pursue the investigation despite personal risks and institutional pressure became an example for other whistleblowers and investigators who faced similar challenges in exposing government misconduct. The 3 soldiers whose deaths had been concealed for decades received posthumous recognition for their service and sacrifice, with their families finally receiving the answers and closure that had been denied to them for more than 70 years. The ceremony honoring their memory was attended by current military leadership who acknowledged the institutional failures that had led to this and the cover-up that had followed. Marcus stood with Duke at his side during the memorial service, reflecting on the chain of events that had brought justice to forgotten soldiers and accountability to those who had betrayed their trust. The peaceful forest that had become his home would always carry the memory of what had been buried there, but it would also represent the power of truth to overcome even the most determined efforts at concealment.
The investigation had taught Marcus that true peace could not be found by avoiding difficult truths, but only by confronting them with courage and determination. His discovery in the Michigan woods had evolved from a personal quest for solitude into a mission of public service that honored both his military training and his commitment to justice. As federal investigators packed their equipment and prepared to leave his property for the final time, Marcus felt a sense of completion that had eluded him since his retirement from active duty. The mission was accomplished, the truth had been revealed, and justice had been served for 3 soldiers who had given their lives in service to their country. Duke's tail wagged as they walked back toward the cabin, the dog's contentment reflecting the peace that came from knowing that dangerous secrets had been brought into the light where they could no longer cause harm. The forest was quiet again, but it was the quiet of resolution rather than concealment, the silence of truth rather than secrecy. 2 years had passed since the last federal investigator left Marcus's property, and the Michigan forest had reclaimed its natural rhythm. The excavation sites had been carefully restored, with native plants taking root in the disturbed soil and wildlife returning to patterns that predated the human disruption. Duke moved through the woods with the confidence of an elder statesman, his chocolate coat now showing threads of silver around his muzzle, but his alertness remained sharp and focused. Marcus had found an unexpected equilibrium between his desire for solitude and his new role as an advocate for government accountability. His consulting work with the Defense Department's Inspector General's office allowed him to investigate cases remotely much of the time, using the secure communication equipment installed in his cabin to participate in meetings and review classified documents. The irony that his home now contained more sophisticated technology than the prototype equipment that had killed 3 soldiers in 1952 was not lost on him.
The recognition that followed the Operation Deep Forest investigation had brought Marcus into contact with other veterans who had encountered evidence of institutional cover-ups during their service. His cabin became an informal meeting place for a network of former military personnel who shared information about suspicious incidents and helped coordinate investigations into historical misconduct. Duke served as an unofficial greeter for these visitors, his calm demeanor helping to put troubled veterans at ease as they shared their stories. The success of the Operation Deep Forest case had also attracted attention from families of other service members who had died in classified circumstances. Marcus found himself serving as an informal liaison between these families and federal agencies, using his military background and investigative experience to help navigate the complex bureaucratic processes involved in obtaining information about classified incidents. The work was emotionally demanding but deeply satisfying, providing closure to families who had spent decades wondering about the fate of their loved ones. One particularly significant case involved the family of a Navy pilot who had disappeared during a test flight in 1959, with official records indicating only that the aircraft had been lost during a routine training mission. Marcus's investigation revealed that the pilot had actually been testing experimental navigation equipment that used principles similar to those employed in Operation Deep Forest. The pilot's family was eventually able to obtain acknowledgement of his service and proper military burial, bringing an end to 60 years of uncertainty. Duke's reputation as an early warning system for environmental hazards had evolved into a second career of sorts, with Marcus occasionally bringing the dog to assist in investigations of potentially contaminated sites. Duke's sensitivity to electromagnetic radiation and chemical contamination had proven remarkably accurate, helping investigators identify dangerous areas before expensive equipment could be deployed. The dog seemed to understand the importance of his role, approaching these assignments with a seriousness that contrasted sharply with his playful demeanor during their daily walks. The partnership between Marcus and Duke had deepened through their shared experiences with federal investigations and their work helping other veterans. The dog had learned to recognize the signs when Marcus was preparing for travel to Washington or other locations for meetings and testimony, automatically shifting into a more alert mode that ensured his handler's emotional stability during stressful periods. Marcus had come to rely on Duke's intuitive understanding of his moods and needs, finding in the dog a steadiness that complemented his own analytical approach to problem-solving. Marcus's testimony before congressional committees investigating government accountability had led to significant policy changes affecting how the military conducted experimental research. New protocols required independent oversight of all testing involving human subjects, and families of service members who died in classified circumstances gained new rights to information about the circumstances of those deaths. The reforms were modest but meaningful, representing the first systematic effort to address the culture of secrecy that had enabled cover-ups like Operation Deep Forest. The personal cost of Marcus's public role in exposing government misconduct had been considerable, requiring him to sacrifice much of the privacy he had sought in retiring to the Michigan woods. Media attention and political scrutiny had transformed his quiet cabin into a destination for journalists and documentary filmmakers who wanted to tell the story of Operation Deep Forest and its broader implications. Marcus accepted these intrusions as part of his responsibility to ensure that the lessons learned from his investigation were not forgotten. Duke adapted to the increased attention with characteristic grace, becoming comfortable with cameras and recording equipment while maintaining his protective instincts toward Marcus. The dog seemed to understand the difference between friendly visitors and potential threats, adjusting his behavior accordingly, while never losing the alertness that had first detected the electromagnetic contamination in the buried chamber. His presence provided continuity and stability as Marcus's life evolved from private retirement to public service. The environmental restoration of Marcus's property had become a model for other sites where classified research had resulted in contamination. The techniques developed for neutralizing electromagnetic radiation and chemical residues were applied to similar locations across the country, allowing families to visit burial sites of service members who had died in experimental accidents. Marcus served as a consultant on these restoration projects, ensuring that the environmental cleanup met standards that protected both human health and ecological integrity. The network of veterans and families that had formed around Marcus's investigation work had evolved into a formal organization dedicated to exposing government cover-ups and supporting families seeking information about classified incidents. The group operated from Marcus's property during summer months, when the restored forest provided a peaceful setting for meetings and planning sessions. Duke served as the unofficial mascot for these gatherings, his calm presence helping to create an atmosphere of trust and cooperation among participants who had often been betrayed by institutions they had served faithfully. Marcus's relationship with Agent Richardson had evolved from professional cooperation to genuine friendship, built on mutual respect for each other's commitment to truth and accountability. Richardson visited the cabin regularly, sometimes for official business but increasingly for personal conversations about the challenges of investigating government misconduct while remaining loyal to institutional values. Duke seemed to enjoy these visits, responding to Richardson's arrival with enthusiasm that reflected his understanding of the agent's importance to Marcus's work. The success of the Operation Deep Forest investigation had inspired other veterans to come forward with evidence of institutional cover-ups, creating a steady stream of cases that kept Marcus busy with research and testimony. Each investigation required him to balance competing demands of national security and public accountability, drawing on his military experience to understand when secrecy was legitimate and when it was being used to conceal misconduct. The work challenged him intellectually, while providing a sense of purpose that had been missing during his early retirement. Duke's advancing age had begun to slow their daily walks through the forest, but the dog remained eager to explore new areas of the property and investigate interesting scents. Marcus had adjusted their routines to accommodate Duke's changing physical capabilities, while maintaining the intellectual stimulation that the dog clearly enjoyed from their investigation work. The partnership that had begun as a therapeutic relationship for Marcus's combat stress had evolved into a true collaboration based on mutual trust and shared purpose. The legacy of Operation Deep Forest extended beyond the specific case to influence broader discussions about the proper relationship between military secrecy and democratic accountability. Marcus's willingness to pursue the investigation despite personal risks had demonstrated that individual citizens could successfully challenge institutional cover-ups when they possessed the skills and determination necessary to uncover hidden truths. The case became a subject of study in military ethics courses and government accountability programs, ensuring that future leaders would understand both the importance of operational security and the dangers of unchecked secrecy. Marcus found unexpected satisfaction in his role as a mentor to younger veterans who were struggling with their own transitions from military to civilian life. His cabin became a retreat where these veterans could find peace in the restored forest, while learning how to channel their military skills toward civilian purposes that served the broader public interest. Duke's gentle presence helped these visitors feel welcome and safe, creating an environment where healing and growth could occur naturally. The completion of environmental restoration efforts on Marcus's property had revealed natural beauty that had been hidden for decades beneath the contamination left by Cold War research programs. Native wildflowers had returned to areas that had been barren, and wildlife populations had recovered to levels that exceeded pre-contamination baselines. The forest had become a living testament to the power of patience and careful stewardship to heal damage that had once seemed permanent. As Marcus approached his 40th birthday, he reflected on the unexpected path his life had taken since discovering the buried chamber in his woods. The investigation that had begun as a simple exploration of his new property had evolved into a mission that gave meaning to his military service and provided purpose for his civilian life. The isolation he had originally sought had been replaced by meaningful connections with other veterans and families who shared his commitment to truth and accountability. Duke's contentment in their restored forest home reflected the peace that both man and dog had found through their shared journey from discovery to justice. The dog's early detection of environmental contamination had initiated a process that brought closure to grieving families and accountability to institutional misconduct, demonstrating the importance of trusting instincts and following evidence wherever it might lead. The quiet that now filled Marcus's forest was different from the silence that had originally drawn him to the property. It was the peace of resolution rather than avoidance, the calm that came from confronting difficult truths rather than hiding from them. Duke's satisfied sighs as he rested on the cabin porch reflected his understanding that their mission had been accomplished and their service recognized. Marcus had learned that true healing from the traumas of military service came not from isolation but from finding ways to use his skills and experience in service of causes larger than himself. The investigation that had begun with Duke's strange behavior near a buried chamber had evolved into a lifetime commitment to ensuring that the sacrifices of service members were honored rather than concealed. The forest that surrounded their cabin would always carry the memory of what had been buried there, but it now also represented the power of truth to overcome even the most determined efforts at concealment. Marcus and Duke had found their peace not by avoiding the world's complexities but by confronting them with courage, determination, and an unshakable commitment to justice. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.